Well, good evening, everybody. Glad you're here. Are you guys ready to get started? I am. Let's go ahead and jump right into the text. We're in Judges chapter 7. We're talking about identity and purpose. We've been talking about Gideon for a couple of weeks now, and we've been making our way well into the story. And so let's go ahead and jump in on this. Let's review. Let's play catch up real quickly on this. We know that Moses and Joshua had brought these guys into the promised land, and there they were, perfectly positioned for God's good blessing, this blessing of land flowing with milk and honey. But they made some huge mistakes, right? Israelites failed to take all the land and conquer all the people. They start adding other gods to the one true God, start drifting away from the one true God. The Midianites come in and start taking over the people and fighting with them. They take over their crops and they impoverish the Israelites. In return, the Israelites end up living in mountains and caves. In fact, that's where we find the opening to this whole story of Gideon there in Judges chapter 6. There he is. He's hiding from the Midianites, threshing wheat in this wine press. Doesn't want anybody to know he's there, but he's there. We also notice then that God sees his people, feels for his people, and the great Redeemer, here he comes. He says, listen, I'm here to redeem my people. And so he taps Gideon on the shoulder and says, you're going to be the one that's going to restore my people back to their promised position. And so here we see in chapter 7 that Gideon rallies an army together. Let's kind of look at our first point here tonight. We noticed this last week, at the end of last week. Gideon believes God and says yes to his assignment. Remember that big phrase, the Lord is with you, O mighty warrior, or O valiant warrior. That's what Gideon believes here. He believes that something is in him, maybe that he had forgotten, maybe that he didn't even know was there, but he's been encouraged on the inside to be more. And I want us to make sure that we get this as we start, because this is a key component of identity and purpose, this idea of having a yes mentality. Saying yes means God's going to do his awesome, cool God thing on his part, and then we've got to do our part as well over here. God's simply not going to fix a problem just because I ask him to. If we want help, for example, with a struggling relationship, we can't just pray to God and then go sit on our couch and expect God to fix the problem for us. God wants me to be participating with him in the effort of making things better. Last week we saw at the end of chapter 6, Gideon destroys this Baal altar in his own hometown, and he raises an altar of the Lord. The townspeople kind of confront him about this, but his dad ends up kind of standing up for him and saying, if excuse me, if Baal is so awesome, then let Baal deal with Gideon. And it's with these few small decisions to step out and say yes that Gideon's leadership raises. All right? These few small decisions. We'll notice in verse 34 then that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. I think that maybe in the NIV it says is clothed with him. So I want us to kind of get this picture, all right? Little decisions of saying yes and God's Spirit coming in. So you see little decisions, God's Spirit coming in. He gives him enough faith and courage to make bigger decisions, and the Lord comes in and strengthens him there. Then he ends up making these big decisions, and God comes in and blesses him and strengthens him there. I really like the way that works. I was rereading this the other day. For guys my age, and I'm not going to give that away to you, but for guys my age, doing 30 minutes of aerobic exercise and 30 minutes of resistance exercise 3 times a week will keep you fit and strong for the long term. Right? And so I really want us to kind of see this. It's not doing the big lifting days that are going to make you strong for the long term. It's the little moments every day of saying yes, of finding our identity, finding and searching for our purpose, and following on that God blesses. Okay? I want y'all to see that right off. Okay? Some of my teachers at the Sunset School of Preaching, they encouraged us in our learning of these massive amounts of information and text. And they always said, inch by inch is a cinch, and a yard by yard is hard. That's the idea we're talking about here. So Gideon says yes to his identity and to this purpose. And he starts making decisions accordingly, and just in time, right? Right here, between chapter 6 and chapter 7, we see the Midianites forming an army. They combine with the Amalekites and the other eastern nations to form this massive army. So imagine over there on your map, you see Gad. All this big army forms. They cross over the river, and they head there towards the valley or the plain of Jezreel, and there they park. Now, I want you guys to get a mental. The enemy comes right in the middle of the Israelite nation and parks and says, I dare you to come and defeat me, right? And so Gideon calls out to the neighboring tribes. First, he calls out to his kinfolk. We see in the beginning of chapter 6 that he's an Abizrite. I'm not really sure how to say that, but that's as close as I can get. So he calls them, hey, kinfolk, come on. It'd be like me calling the Harrimans, right? All you H.A. Harrimans and all you H.E. Harrimans, come on, let's join and fight. And then he starts calling some of the other tribes that are around him. And if you look there on your map, you see that he calls Manasseh and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali. And he gets about 32,000 guys. That's good. That's good. So he calls them all together, but check out what happens. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. Let's take a look at this. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Now there's a key word, key phrase in there, right? Those who were scared or afraid. I tell you, if there was ever a place that we can kind of relate to or connect with Gideon, we see a farmer being asked to be a military general, which he's not, right? A farmer turned military general, right? And we can relate to this totally about how he might feel at this moment. I think we've all felt scared, outnumbered, intimidated, exhausted, going into a new company that just hired you, dealing with family day in, day out, week in, week out. Maybe even in the church and ministry that's stretching you to do new things. Sometimes these can feel like dead weights on your shoulders. You can feel ill-equipped to handle all of these demands. I think Gideon was feeling these same pressures that you and I feel. See, here's our first big point in the life of Gideon as it relates to identity and purpose. Through our weaknesses, we experience God's strength. No matter how impactful his encounters with God had been, with the fleece and all that back and forth, the 32,000 soldiers he had scrounged together were still going to be no match for the 135,000 of the Midianite army camped in the valley below with all their camels and all their caravans, right? He was completely outnumbered. And as long as he focused on the differences between their forces and his confidence was always going to be weak. The Bible is filled with these kinds of stories where God parlays our weaknesses. Delaney, that was just for you. She always laughs every time I use a big word. Parlays, right, our weaknesses into a demonstration of God's strength. It's just chock full of these examples. And it makes it so encouraging for me because I connect. I feel like one of those little guys. I connect with Gideon in so many ways, and maybe you do too. You remember in Luke 9, the feeding of the 5,000? Most of the time we think this story is about hungry people being fed, but I really think it's about the apostles realizing God's available resources. The same in 1 Samuel chapter 17. We know this story very well. David gets the 5 stones and goes and defeats Goliath. The power is not in the stones. The power is in God using the 5 little stones. I think God tests our faith for a couple of reasons. Number one, to show us whether our faith is real or counterfeit. Now, I want you to focus in on that second and third word in there. To show us whether our faith is real or counterfeit. Not to show God. I think God already knows what kind of faith we have, whether it's real or not real, right? This is for us. Can you kind of see that in Gideon? He's saying, Gideon, I need you to see something in you, right? I need you to see what you have that maybe you don't see just yet. So this is part of that, right? Secondly, God tests us to strengthen our faith for the task that He has set before us. Totally focusing in on our purpose and our future purpose, right? Notice this, that God says that such boasting is against me. And now that's in the New International Version from verse 2. And so this is a really, really big point here. And so I want you to really pay attention to this. Hang in here. As soon as we begin to believe that we deserve credit for rescuing or delivering ourselves, we take away the glory that God deserves. We set up ourselves as alternative saviors, and this is the greatest spiritual danger that there is, that we should believe that we can save and have saved ourselves. This lesson we always need to learn is that salvation is by God's gracious action and not by earning it with our own actions. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 actually talks about this. Let's take a look at it. In verses 7 through 9, it says this. So to keep me from, Paul's talking here, So to keep me from being conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And that's totally powerful. And they're talking exactly about what we've been discussing right here. Verse 10 goes on to say of that passage, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And this, our culture seems to say the opposite, but in humility, there is great strength. When people see Christians doing good or even great things that they know that they couldn't be doing on their own, they can't help but see that God's the source of their strength. Humility says, look how weak I am. I know my faults and my weaknesses. Other people know my faults and my weaknesses. And the only way I can do these things is by God's good doing. So let's look at how strong He is, right? So here's our big teaching point so far. That Gideon and all of Israel were going to be tempted to put their confidence in their fighting men. But God removes virtually all of them so that the victory will lead them to trust God in new ways. I like those last 2 phrases. To trust God in new ways. This is a great example of a growing faith, this in new ways, in ways that I haven't achieved yet. So this is what humility does. It helps us to grow spiritually. Spiritual amnesia was a regular problem for the nation of Israel. Even after their divinely orchestrated rescue mission from Egypt, they quickly forgotten the kindness and mercy of God. And so Moses has to spend the entire book of Deuteronomy reminding them of all the great things that God has done on their behalf. Pride forgets. Humility remembers. If we were to clearly and concisely hone those things down, that's what it would say. These are the two key components of spiritual identity. With pride, arrogance, and self-reliance occur God's opposition and shut the door on His favor. But humility fosters a dependence upon Him, unleashing His power in our lives. If anything was going to be the downfall of the Israelites, it wasn't going to be the Midianites. It was going to be their pride. And so God purposefully, lovingly stripped down Gideon's army to the bare bones, leaving them no choice but to trust God for their victory. Gang, let's cling ferociously then to humility. Let's draw a line in the sand of our hearts and evict this horrendous tenant once and for all, okay? So let's check out what happens next in our text. For most of us, we kind of know this story. We know that, so with the 10,000 left, God says, that's still way too many. Why don't you guys send the rest of the 10,000 now down to the water and drink? And by the differences in the way they drink, I want you guys to separate. And so that's what He does. Look at verse 7. Verse 7 kind of sums up that little story right there. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go every man to his home. I love that in verse 7. I will deliver you with 300. People who live by faith know their weakness more and more as they depend on God's strength. So let's talk for just a moment as we begin to close about letting go. Gideon had to let go of 31,700 people. That's hard, gang. Letting go is a hard thing to do. You know, it seems like it almost would have been easier for Gideon if he would have started with 300. But when he blew that trumpet and all his fellow brothers from those tribes came, I mean, they had covered that mountainside, but you can imagine the massive difference. His view now is only of 300 men. The contrast would have been startling and humbling. One that might have scared Gideon into holding on to what God was asking him to release. And gratefully, Gideon let them go. Will you? It's almost as if God is coming into our lives and He's looking at all the things around us, all the things that we're holding on to, and He's saying, do you really need that? Is that really going to help you fulfill purpose and identity? So here's my last point, gang. Don't try to retain what God is asking you to release. How many of us still don't understand our identity because we're holding on to some things? How many of us have never stepped into purpose, never moved forward, have never trusted in God because we're still holding on to some things? So what's the Lord asking you to release to Him? Is it time? Maybe money? Security? Maybe it's stability or relationships. Maybe it's hard to see it to let go because it's been so plentiful in your life and has brought you so much comfort. And I totally get that. That's understandable. But let's take a deep breath and let's let go of it anyway. And I assure you, you're better off with God's 300 than you'll ever be with your own 32,000. So that's my challenge for you this week. Are there some things that you need to let go of? Pray about it and then say yes. Start down this path of slowly saying yes to your identity and purpose, and look at God bless you in incredible ways. Thanks, gang. Appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.